I will start out by saying to understand how annexation came about, we really have to go back to 1967. Okay, I won't go through everything, but immediately after the end of the war, Israel began incremental forms of annexation on the ground without saying it. It expanded the municipal borders of Jerusalem and effectively placed those expanded parts of East Jerusalem under full Israeli control, de facto annexation, without calling it anything. And I'm going that far back to make the case that that became a precedent for what happened essentially over the next few decades after the war. The next landmark would be, of course, the start of the settlement projects, which are a form of physical presence that makes Israel's hold over the region permanent, at that time both in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The next pit stop will be 1980 and 1981, when Israel passed two important laws. One was a basic law, which has constitutional status. British people know about that. That essentially said Jerusalem is now all under Israeli law and jurisdiction. All of Jerusalem, that is an effective statement of annexation without using the term annexation or sovereignty, just saying law and jurisdiction. It's a basic law. Very shortly after that, Israel passed a law with identical language extending Israeli law and jurisdiction over the Golan Heights. Another form of legal de facto annexation without calling it that. The settlement project, meanwhile, of course, expands and expands. So you have essentially physical forms of incremental creeping annexation. You have a developing legal process for Israel entrenching its hold over the region, but Israel didn't say it openly. What happened is over the last decade, due to various political forces that we don't have time to go into right now, but a sort of competitiveness on the right and empowerment and growth of the right-wing pro-settler community led both the settlers and the mainstream right-wing community in Israel, including Mr. Netanyahu's ruling Likud, to basically kind of embrace the approach that Israel had a right to permanently stay in the West Bank. This is after pulling settlements out of Gaza, and increasingly talked in terms of extending sovereignty, usually avoiding the term annexation. The big change comes in 2019, because up until 2019, Netanyahu has a way of cultivating proxies within his government, coalition partners, young politicians, to advance these ideas without actually saying it himself. So sort of projecting to the world that Israel's leader is not actually advancing annexation, but these other far-right forces are. But in 2019, Netanyahu himself jumps sort of into the rhetorical arena by making a series of open promises to annex settlements in various increments. I want to pause and say that by this time, okay, I'm jumping through 5 decades of Israeli occupation. The best estimates right now put the settler population between the West Bank and East Jerusalem at roughly 650 to 700,000 settlers. That includes East Jerusalem. About 428,000 of those are in the West Bank. Netanyahu begins with a series of promises all throughout 2019, while he's facing very competitive elections and a tightening noose of legal trouble. He's under investigation, then he's under indictment, now he's facing his trials opening. So in order to go through the different proposals that are now on the table for the kind of annexation we're looking at, I think we can pull up the first map. We have a few maps to show you which will really help clarify what it means that Israel's considering this. Okay, here you have Israel and the West Bank. The first thing to keep in mind as the most basic background is the yellow part and the blue part. The blue part, okay, is what we call Area C. It is essentially the part of the West Bank where all settlements are located. These are areas that were defined in the Oslo agreements of 1993. And by definition, if there's a settlement, it is by definition part of Area C. Now, that whole area is not full of settlements, but all the settlements that exist are spread out throughout that entire area. The yellow parts are areas A and B together. Okay, Area C you can see is very big. That blue part is very big. It's about 60% of the West Bank, actually a little bit more. A and B together are the yellow parts, and the areas that we call Area A, which are the part most under control of the Palestinian Authority for local and civil affairs and internal security, okay? That's Area A, and it's the smallest piece of it. Area B has Palestinian Authority civil control, but joint security control with the Israeli army. However, the Israeli army is the ultimate sovereign over the entire West Bank. What you're seeing here is the map that basically you can say it's the Oslo Breakdown, okay? So just so you know, all settlements are in the blue parts. Now, to understand why that's important, you have to realize that the first promise Netanyahu made about open annexation, when he first started talking about openly saying we will extend sovereignty, it was in April, just before the elections were held in 2019, and his first statement was that he would annex all the settlements. And now you know where all the settlements are. They're spread all around that blue part. So you can kind of see for yourself on the map that if all settlements are annexed to Israel, that's the end of Palestinian contiguity, because the areas left for the Palestinians are broken up. The next thing he did, which happened over in the fall, ahead of just around the September elections, because we had many elections this year, was to promise to start by annexing the Jordan Valley. Okay, you can't see my cursor, but the Jordan Valley is the area basically along the Dead Sea going up through the north. Maybe, Isabel, can you move your cursor from the
Dead Sea going up to Jericho?
Yeah, going up north. So that big, thick blue band, that big, thick blue area, that is Area C because it's blue, basically between the Dead Sea and the northern border, that's the Jordan Valley, okay? And that was what Netanyahu then promised to annex in the autumn, in the fall. Now you can see that if Israel annexes the Jordan Valley, the West Palestinian areas are permanently surrounded by Israel. It's essentially like enclosing the Palestinian areas. That was the next, and the next thing that happened after that, after his September promises to annex the Jordan Valley, was the announcement of the Trump plan in January. We can go to the next slide, and we'll show you. Yeah, there we go. Can you make that a little bit smaller? Okay, perfect. I hope everybody can see that. Okay, the Trump plan basically says the only areas that would ever go to a future Palestinian state are those areas of A and B, those isolated kind of chunks of land that are currently under some form of Palestinian Authority control, of course, under the overarching umbrella of IDF control. But that's all there will ever be for a Palestinian state, including a portion of Area C. What does a portion of Area C mean? Well, the Trump plan proposed that Israel annex about 30% of the West Bank. In other words, about half of Area C, which, as you remember, is 60% of the West Bank. So it basically means keeping all settlements, but to do that, Israel basically has to leave its settlements deep inside territory that is completely surrounded by the Palestinian areas. And if you can show with the cursor, if you can kind of trace the brown lines that swivel through the blue lines, yeah, that's where Israeli settlements will be, all surrounded by Palestine, because the Trump plan doesn't propose the annexation of all of Area C, but only a portion of it. This is why the security establishment does not like the Trump plan. They don't want to be responsible for, isolated settlement, strips of land deep inside Palestinian territory. But just to give you an example, okay, those are the three basic proposals that kind of are under Netanyahu's rubric. And I view the Trump plan as essentially an extension of Netanyahu's vision, because it's very close in every other way in terms of the explanations and the language and the fact that the Palestinian state of the future is almost unachievable and almost unviable. It's very similar to Netanyahu's vision throughout the years. But to understand why that is such a game changer from the past from roughly 2000, okay, onwards for the last 20 years, the idea of peace has taken the form of a paradigm of the two-state solution. And the two-state solution meant Israel roughly around the Green Line and Palestine roughly around the Green Line. So to show you what that would have looked like, the kind of thing we've all been talking about for about the last 20 years, You can go to the next slide, okay, which is based on the Geneva Initiative. It's the most elaborate version of the two-state plan. This is what the Palestinian state was supposed to have looked like, at least under the Geneva plan. Now, the Geneva plan is something that was finalized based on negotiations in 2000 and completed by the negotiators long after the negotiations had fell apart in 2003. So this is an old idea. Not everybody.
We're gonna have to
yeah, I know. We're gonna. This is basically it.
Got much time for.
No. I'm gonna finish up. And just so you can see, all those blue bubbles inside the green areas of the West Bank, yeah, those are areas that were supposed to be annexed to Israel and form the basis of most formal negotiations in the year 2000 under Ehud Barak and under Ehud Olmert in 2008. That was the basic framework of negotiation that the Americans agreed on, the Israelis and the Palestinians, you know, had a hard time accepting it, but those were the parameters. And then go back to the previous slide just to make the contrast clear. That is what we're looking at now for a potential Palestinian state. And the conditions on that Palestinian state are so kind of unrealistic that I think most observers of the Trump plan think it's destined never to get there.